Morning, girls. I hope you're having a good day. Sorry that I'm not with you in class today. We will do the finish up or do your actual debate on the War of 1812 when I'm back in class tomorrow. So make sure you have all your stuff with you for that. What I wanted to do today was just talk about what happens in the actual War of 1812 itself. This way you have this material down. It would allow you to fill out a warfare analysis chart about the War of 1812, either during class today or for homework tonight, and you need to make sure that you've completed that by Friday. Just to review what we've talked about previously, there were three main causes to the War of 1812. The first is the continued impressment of American sailors. We've talked about that repeatedly at this point, that American sailors, or British people who are working as American sailors, are on American ships, are being captured by the British and forced to work for the British Navy. We also saw at the Battle of Tippecanoe that the British were arming the Native Americans, which we perceived as a huge injustice, that they were riling up our enemies. And there also are a number of people in the United States, particularly in the western area, which at the time is around Ohio, who are very interested in using the war, going to war, being hawkish about war, in order to start the capture of Canada and to gain more territory for the United States. This war isn't very long, and as you'll see, doesn't really have long-term major changes to America's territory. So rather than doing it chronologically, I broke it up into three different regions where the war takes place. So the first region is around Ohio, the Canada and Great Lakes region. I'll start with the bottom bullet point first, because in this region, the United States lost almost all of the battles. The dream that we would march into Canada and take over and it would be very easy turned out to not be true. The Canadian people, British colonists at the time, they resisted the United States' encroachment very strongly. So this war does not go the way that we thought in this region of the United States. The two major American victories each are interesting for their own way, so that's why I chose to talk about them here. The Battle of the Thames is a battle near Detroit, and at that battle, Tecumseh, who's fighting on the side of the British, is killed. And the reason this is so significant is that, as we talked about before, Tecumseh is trying to lead the Shawnee and other native tribes to unite. If Tecumseh had been able to live past the war, if he'd continued to be successful in getting native tribes to join together, it's entirely possible that Native American history would be different, that they would have been able to, resist or at least slow down American expansion to the West. That would have had a big impact on our country's history and on the history of Native Americans. But when Tecumseh is killed at the Battle of the Thames, it sort of dooms Native Americans because this is their last good chance to unite and resist against American removal to the West. The second big battle that America wins in this region takes place in Lake Erie. If you've ever been to Put-in-Bay or up near the Lake Erie Islands, maybe an hour and a half west of Cleveland, you've assuredly seen things that have to do with the Battle of Lake Erie, because that's where that battle took place. Oliver Hazard Perry, who was leading the American naval forces on Lake Erie, severely outgunned, but knew the area very well, and launches a surprise attack and routs the British ships near Put-in-Bay. His famous slogan from this war, from this battle, is "Don't give up the ship." And maybe you've seen, it's very common in this part of Ohio, but particularly up around the islands, for people to have navy blue flags that say "Don't give up the ship," or as a reference to this battle. If you go to Put-in-Bay, you may have been to the Perry Memorial. It's like a 6-story tall column, and you can go up to the top, and there's beautiful views of Lake Erie. You can see all the way across to Canada. That's a commemoration of this battle. And about 5 years ago, when we were celebrating the bicentennial of the War of 1812, in that summer they did a full reenactment of the Battle of Lake Erie. So in this part of Ohio, this is something that we think a lot about and is a particularly important part of our local history. This is also why there's so many things around here that are named Perry. There's a lot of cities or towns, schools that have that name because of the local connection to that battle. The second region where the fighting takes place is the Mid-Atlantic region. This also does not go well for the United States. The war in Europe ends in 1814, which allows the British to dedicate their entire forces against the United States. The British will send an invasion force that will land near Washington, D.C., catches the United States completely by surprise. Washington, D.C. was basically unguarded. There were very few American soldiers there. And the British march in and they burn it to the ground. They burn down the White House, the Capitol building, the Library of Congress, which was in the Capitol at the time. They totally destroy the city. They did this because the Americans had burned down a Canadian city. I don't remember, Hamilton maybe. I'm not sure exactly which place in Ontario, but in retaliation, the British burned down Washington, D.C. There's famous scenes where Dolly Madison, the First Lady, puts herself at great risk to ensure that certain things are removed from the White House, including a portrait of George Washington, which would have been destroyed in the fire. So it's a very embarrassing moment for the United States. It's a huge loss, and it's significant for the construction of D.C. I think we talked about this at least briefly with our guides while we were in D.C., so you may have heard of it. The British plan, since most of the American East Coast was unguarded, was to march up and continue to burn down major American cities. The next one north would have been Baltimore. So as they're sailing up the Chesapeake Bay, the only thing protecting them from entering Baltimore Harbor and burning down that city is an American fort called Fort McHenry. You can see a drawing of this in the picture on the left. To everyone's great surprise, despite being bombarded throughout the night, the American flag was still flying at Fort McHenry the next morning, which prevented the British from entering the harbor and saved Baltimore, potentially saved other cities on the East Coast too, because they would have continued up into places like Philadelphia if they'd been able to attack Baltimore. This is what our national anthem is written about. So Francis Scott Key was actually sitting as a prisoner on a British ship during this battle and wrote a poem about what he saw, right? The bombs bursting in air gave the proof of the night that our flag was still there. And eventually those lyrics that he wrote were set to a famous British pub song, a song that people would sing while they were drinking and being social. And that became our national anthem. So the tune to our national anthem is a song that people would have been familiar with, was not originally composed as our national anthem. But the lyrics are written about the Battle of Fort McHenry, which was an important American victory that prevented real catastrophe during the War of 1812. The only region of the United States where the war actually goes well is in the South. The U.S. Army in the South is led primarily by Andrew Jackson, who's a very, very colorful character and known as an incredible general. And he uses this war as an opportunity to really take the fight to the Native Americans, some of whom have sided with the British. So the Creek Indians and other Native tribes are really routed and weakened significantly as a result of the War of 1812. This is going to be make it that much easier for them to be moved to the West when Andrew Jackson will become president about 20 years after this. The other big thing that happens in the South is that Andrew Jackson wins a very significant battle against the British at the Battle of New Orleans. The other thing interesting about this battle is that it took place after the war was over. You might be confused by that. It is a little confusing, but remember, signing the peace treaty would have taken place in Europe. It would have taken 6 weeks for that word to get across the ocean by boat. There's no electronic communication at the time. So they didn't realize that the war had ended. And that's why these, you still had a major battle that took place after technically the treaty had been signed because nobody had been notified of it. So the other thing that's really important about this war is that, as you can see from the debates that we're having, the decision to go to war was far from universally supported. The Federalist Party, which was largely based among people who did trade and manufacturing, primarily in the northeastern states and in cities in the northeastern states, like Boston. They dissented against this war. They thought it was a horrible decision. They primarily relied on trade with Britain for their livelihoods. So they economically were very hurt by the potential for a war with Britain. And some of these Federalist politicians meet in 1814 in Hartford, where they talk about how they're going to respond to the fact that the country has gone to war in what they would say an unjust way. And at this Hartford convention, some of them float the idea that maybe the northeastern states, the Federalists, should consider leaving the United States. I'm not clear on whether it was leave the United States and become a separate country, leave the United States and rejoin Great Britain, which might have been economically beneficial to these regions. None of this ever happens. It was really just a conversation that they had about strategy, but when information about that is released to the public, it puts an incredible black eye for the Federalist Party. To be seen as talking about leaving the country during a time of war, they're perceived as traitors, and this will be the end of the Federalist Party. You will not, Federalist politicians are going to stop winning elections. Eventually, they don't even run candidates for president anymore, and this is the death of one of our two major parties. Eventually, a new party, the Whig, W-H-I-G, Whig Party, will be created to take its place. They're going to be important when we talk about the Civil War. But this Hartford Convention is an example of an event that kills off one of our two major parties, and we go through a very political realignment as a result of it. So, to talk about how the war ends, it ends in 1815, and it ends sort of with a whimper rather than with a bang. As I mentioned before, the war in Europe had ended, and the reason that Britain had been attacking American ships to impress sailors was because they needed people to fight against the French, and they were concerned about our trade in Europe and how it might be aiding the French. But when the war with France is over and Napoleon has been defeated, Britain doesn't need to attack our ships anymore, and all of the things that had caused the war, they just sort of stop. As a result of the Treaty of Gents, all land was returned to its original owner, so there really isn't a clear winner or loser, and no spoils are taken, no land exchanges hands. The major consequences of this war, however, are really three things. The first is that this war is catastrophic for Native Americans, not just with the death of Tecumseh, but just general weakening of Indian positions around the United States. It's going to make it significantly easier for Native tribes to be removed to the west. So the real losers of the war are the Native Americans. This war is going to increase the profile of Andrew Jackson. He's going to become an American hero as a result of the War of 1812. And, Andrew Jackson is a very controversial American president. He has a very mixed record for modern historians. He has incredibly awful racist opinions about Native Americans, and his behavior towards Native Americans while he's president we would consider pretty awful by modern standards. At the same time, Andrew Jackson is very involved in expanding the right to vote to all white men, no matter what their land holding status is. So Andrew Jackson is important for the political realignment of the United States, a realignment where poor and middle-class white men get access to the ballot, which is an important improvement in terms of who can vote in the United States. So there's sort of a mixed record there, but Andrew Jackson will catapult himself to the presidency because of the success he has during the War of 1812. And finally, and this will be what you read about next, the aftermath of the War of 1812 is an idea that maybe it's America's destiny to continue to expand to the west and to control all of the land on the continent. If you think about it from the perspective of someone living in 1815, in one generation's time, the United States has fought two major wars against the strongest country on earth. Won the first one, didn't lose the second one. This country has more than doubled its territory in that time because of purchasing the Louisiana Purchase. And it seems like this is the country's destiny, that somehow because of our values, because of our beliefs, because God is on our side, which is what some of these people believe, our expansion was inevitable. And it's that idea that it's our destiny to continue to expand to the west that's going to be the next topic that we talk about in class. If you have any questions about this video, please write them down. We'll discuss them during class tomorrow. And at that time, we'll also finish up your War of 1812 debates.